Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. So I got his permission. We're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done, and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right, enjoy.
Our guest today has studied the historical case for the resurrection, arguably more than anybody else alive. In 1976, he published his doctoral dissertation at Michigan State University with the title, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Rational Inquiry. After nearly 5 decades of studying the resurrection, he is just releasing the first of 4 volumes titled On the Resurrection, The Evidences. In this in-depth video, we're going to look at how the debate about Jesus has shifted over the decades, what persuaded Dr. Gary Habermas to spend his life studying the resurrection, what he considers the strongest evidence for the resurrection, and what to expect in this volume and the next 3. Gary, I've been looking forward to this for years since I heard you were working on this. Thanks for joining me. Let's jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I've been looking forward to it for years, too.
Well, you should be excited. You've poured thousands of hours into this, and we're going to get into what you cover in the volume. But before we get to the historical case that you lay out in this newest book, which will involve looking at your 12 minimal facts one by one, what first motivated you to rationally examine the evidence for the resurrection, and did you expect it to become a life's work?
No, no, I would not have expected it, but there's something that might have hinted it, and it was this. In my teen years, I started going through some serious doubts about Christianity, and it lasted for a long time. It lasted for 20 years, straight for 10, and off and on for 10 more, for a total of 20. And it went on past my PhD. So it went on for a long time, and friends started coming up to me, Christian friends, and saying, so what do you need? And I said, evidence. I thought at that time I needed evidence. I wish somebody had told me that there's different kinds of doubt, but evidence. All right, well, have you studied creation? No. All right, you better start studying that. What we call today intelligent design. Oh, well, you better study that. Okay. Well, that's okay. Not bad, but doesn't tell me Christianity is true. Okay. Archaeology. Well, that's nice, but doesn't prove Christianity is true. The New Testament's reliable or almost reliable. I was reading critical material, so I didn't know who to believe. Anyway, they sent me to a bunch of things, and I thought some of them are lousy arguments. Some of them are good arguments, but none of them show Christianity's true. It just shows there's some exciting things about Christianity I didn't know. Then one day in my reading, and I was reading incessantly, I read in a book, if God raised Jesus from the dead, Jesus' teachings must be true, because why else would God do it? And I thought, it's like one sentence. And I thought, wow, that makes sense. And so when archaeology, ID, um, argument, F. Bruce and old arguments for reliability, et cetera, prophecy, which I rejected pretty quickly. When they didn't work, enter into my life the topic of the resurrection. Now, I couldn't have guessed. No, I couldn't have guessed it would take me forever. But if you'd asked me, I'd say, well, what else am I going to study? It's the best topic out there.
Hmm.
So, resurrection answered my factual questions after an incredibly long search. And knowing more about myself, because I found out about emotional doubt and volitional doubt, which I wrote about later. But it's been a lifelong search just for me to master this topic. So that's a short preview.
If it weren't for the doubt that you described experiencing for 20 years, do you think you would have studied and researched the resurrection as much as you have?
No. That is an interesting question. No. My pastor, a German Baptist pastor, came over to my house. He read fluently in German, and his first name was Adolf. And he sat in my living room. He was kind of today we would call him a fideist of sorts. And he begged me, because my mom said I'm really worried about him with his doubts, and he begged me to put away my books and just trust in the Lord. And my mom said the same thing. Just trust in the Lord. My mom said, if you can practice faith for maybe 2 weeks, every time a question comes up, say, no, I believe, no, I believe. After 2 weeks, you'll have a habit. Well, actually, that's pretty sophisticated. You can do that kind of method in psychology for issues. But I said, Mom, I'm not going to get over my doubts by saying, I believe, I believe, I believe. That doesn't make it true. Oh, well. And she didn't know what else to say. So I developed my bad habits. I played a lot of sports, especially hockey and football. And I would play all afternoon, and I would come in at night, turn the light on, didn't care about any homework I had. I was too worried about my doubts. And I started studying. And it's where I learned my bad habits of not turning the light out at 11 or 12, and I'd stay up till 1:30 and have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning for college. And I kept studying. And Sean, there were 100 times when I thought to myself, I'm 1 hour away. I'm almost there. Wow, this is exciting. And I never was. And the next day, 100 questions would rush in, and I was back to it again.
Wow. Now, we could have a whole conversation just about doubt, and you've written some really helpful books on this, but it's amazing because I've gone through seasons of doubt, and oftentimes I wished I didn't have it, but that's what motivated me to help my dad update Evidence That Demands a Verdict. That's in part what motivated me to study the apostles, and I can see a similar thing in your life.
Nobody's ever suggested this, but I probably would have had no reason to go to the resurrection because in the early years, I didn't care if anybody knew what I was reading or not. It was totally from my doubts, totally from me. I didn't care. I didn't go out and tell my friends what I found out. I just kept studying to answer my own questions. And if I didn't have those questions, wow, up in the air on whether I would have got to it.
So this goes way back. Were you keeping note cards? This is probably before personal computers. Like, how were you doing it? Were you arranging this stuff, or is it just in your mind?
I keep a lot of things in my mind. The Lord's blessed me with good memory, but yes, note cards. I Some of your audience is going to go, "What's that?" But I had about 2,000 note cards, and I had them numbered in the upper right-hand corner so I could keep track of them. I mean,
Wow.
otherwise, how do you find one note card out of 2,000? So I numbered them, and I always kept track of the number so I could find it. And I had them in those old trays that you put 3x5 cards in, and I owned 4 or 5 of those in order to hold 2,000 of them. And they must have been kind of sophisticated because later, not only did I use that research in college courses, but I used a lot of those notes for my PhD dissertation years later, and the sources were still relevant. They were a little bit old, so I had to get some newer ones to augment them. But the things I wrote down, my professors had no problem with. So, and the funny thing was, when I was 14, I decided to stop and say, what have I learned so far? And I wrote an essay just for me. Obviously, it wasn't going to be good at high school. I wrote it just for me to remember what I'd learned so far. And the essay was 25 pages long at age 14.
Wow.
And later it grew to 49 pages. When later in upper level college, I needed to get an essay real fast. I wasn't good about doing my homework. I had too much research to do on my doubts. I just dropped that essay on the teacher's desk and he gave me an A. What I wrote years ago, I got an A on. But that was written just for me.
Amazing. I love that. So we're going to get to your book here. And by the way, I think it's probably showing up today. I don't have a physical copy in hand. I understand it's 1,100 pages, 5 pounds. I printed it out in 2 massive documents, front and back. I hope is okay. I've read all of it. Do you have a copy? Hold it up and show us, because this is, holy cow, show us.
This is like the first commercials on the Whopper. It takes 2 hands to handle a Whopper. It takes 2 hands to handle this Whopper.
Turn it sideways so we can see. A little bit towards the middle. Amazing. That's how huge it is. This is a lifetime of study on the resurrection, which is incredible. I hope folks will pick it up. Now, we're going to get into some of the details of it, Gary, but maybe give us a sense of how scholarship as a whole, kind of 30,000-foot view on Jesus and the resurrection, has changed since the 70s.
Let me go back a little before the 70s, because a scary thing was going on for evangelical doubters. A scary thing was going on in the 60s, and it continued into the 70s. But I don't want to get too heavy here, but when German liberalism, that's the time period when all the naturalistic theories of the resurrection came up, from 1799 to about 1920. During the period from 1920 to about 1950 or 60, there was an age when many scholars rebelled against the historical Jesus movement of the German movement, and they didn't want evidences. History was out. You could study history, but not as an evidence to back up the Christian faith. And the 2 biggest names were Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann. They were worlds apart. Barth, probably for sure a believer. Bultmann, to the left of Bart Ehrman today. But here's the thing. Late in that century, Bart Ehrman ran was the most popular name in theology. Both German scholars. Bultmann was a New Testament scholar, and he was a bit of a fideist, a lot of a fideist, and he never gave evidence for anything he said because he didn't believe in historical backup. He would give reasons for things, but not what we would call evidence. And when I went to school, everything was in Bultmann's shadow, and he would say, "Empty tomb? Are you kidding me? That's mythology. Appearances? Well, I know it's in the New Testament, but what difference does that make? The New Testament came from ancient Hellenistic mythology, and that's the stuff that was going on in the 60s. Hellenistic mythology was big, and Bultmann was very influential. He died in 1976, and things started changing a little bit. And the first group of scholars after that didn't want to get too... Here's how you get really conservative in those days. Say Jesus rose from the dead. Now you're an outsider. Say he was raised from the dead bodily, and you're a fighting fundamentalist, because nobody said that. A few people dared to say Jesus rose from the dead, but he rose from the dead as sort of a glorified spirit. But don't get me wrong, he was really there. Sort of like what some Christians believe Paul saw on the way to Damascus. An ethereal, shining Jesus. Strangely enough, no light is associated with Jesus' appearance in the Gospels. Light's never there. But as time went on, now the third quest for the historical Jesus came in about this time. And now conservatism, because of a lot of findings, conservatism is back in, and the resurrection is a hot subject from about 1980 on. I don't mean everybody believes in it, but you're not stupid to talk about it because everybody's talking about it. So I fit right into that group. But unfortunately, Sean, when that was going on and everybody was open to resurrection, my doubts at that time, post-PhD, I say this because I wasn't 14 or 16 or 20, post-PhD, I almost, maybe that's too strong, but I don't think so, almost converted to Buddhism.
Wow.
My doubts were still going on.
Wow.
So I was still torn up about all these questions and things.
So if you had to guess, and maybe this is not even a fair question, I emailed you and I said, how much time do you think you've put into this project, volume 1? And I think you said about 32,000 hours into this.
I actually had a pretty good figure on that.
Oh,
because
tell us.
I've worked 70 hours a week. Now, not all on this, so I had to cut a percentage off, maybe 50%. I've worked 70 hours a week for about this is my 14th year on this project. And I've been working 70 hours a week, as my wife or my research assistant can tell you. So I simply divided 70 times the number of weeks and then took about 50% of it off because I do other things like email and everything else. But I worked 70 hours a week of work. So that figure is probably fairly accurate.
And that's on top of decades before that you've studied it on and off in different ways. So who knows how much time you've put, but minimally 32,000 hours.
Yeah, don't forget the dissertation was in the earlier period. So,
okay, so maybe give us just a quick sense of what's in each of these 4 volumes, and then we'll start getting honed down into this first volume that's actually out soon.
Okay, you want me to give the themes of the 4 volumes?
Yeah, just the kind of broad general themes of what you cover in each one.
Okay. Well, if I hold this up again, you can see the theme of number 1, if I can get it over here. It's evidences. Does that do it?
Yep.
There you go, evidences. Okay. On the resurrection, volume 1 is evidences. And it's my research assistant and Mike Licona. My research assistant has a PhD and did his MA and PhD's thesis and dissertation resurrection. So he and Mike Licona, they said, when are you going to bring out your evidences? I said, probably volume 3. They go, oh, no. And my assistant and Mike agreed. It's got to be volume 1. Start with it. And I begrudgingly said, all right. And now I'm glad I did. So number 1 is the evidences. Number 2 are alternative theories. And I say alternative because not everything is a naturalistic theory. Like I said just a few moments ago, some believers accepted a view in the 60s and 70s that Jesus was truly, truly raised. But he appeared about like what a lot of people think Paul saw on the way to Damascus, kind of ethereal, non-bodily, but really there, not an hallucination. That's not a naturalistic theory, but I had to have a chapter on that.
Gotcha.
So volume 2 is on natural evidences, natural objections, and all their objections. Volume 3 is, I'm moving away from apologetics now with volume 3.
Okay.
Volume 3 started out as 1,500 pages, and we've honed it down to about 800. And it is a who's who of liberal, all the way to very liberal atheist New Testament scholars, all the way to very conservative New Testament writers with credentials, very conservative, but PhD. And what we did was try to survey about 140. My research assistant said it's more like 200. He said he's the one that typed it up. About 140 questions minimum from Good Friday to the Ascension. So you got about 40 days here. And think of all the questions you could ask. Why the third day? How did Jesus appear? What's our earliest evidence? Every question you could think of. And all we do in volume 3 is not argue for anything. We give a landscape view from really liberal to really conservative, so everybody can see. I hope the guys who read it said that volume 3 will be a basis for people doing MA theses and PhD dissertations, because it links the field. Okay. I've written 2 little books on the resurrection of theology and resurrection of practice, but nobody knows about them. They didn't sell a lot. So I'm criticized sometimes. All this guy does is talk about evidence. Does he do anything else on the resurrection? Well, volume 3 is the overview, and volume 4 says, since Jesus has been raised from the dead, what does this say about the Christian worldview, Christology and theology in general, and pastoral theology? And if you want to get really practical, what does the resurrection say to those who've lost loved ones? And since the mother of my 4 children died of stomach cancer in 1995, I wrote a book on it, on grief. I feel like I've got some things to apply the resurrection to grief. So the last volume 4 is very practical.
I got to tell you, of the 4, I'm probably most excited about volumes 2 and 4 because you cover some of the practical side in your book, Risen Indeed, the kingdom of God and dealing with doubt. And I thought, I'd love to see more on this. So expanding that is going to be such a contribution. We'll have you back and we'll talk about that. Now, in this one, we're going to focus on the evidences. Is there anything you've changed your mind on since you wrote your dissertation in 1976? Arguments you thought, you know what, I thought this was strong, I'm backtracking. Arguments thought you were bad that you now buy? Or is your basic argument roughly the same where it was?
Let me start by saying, yeah, there are some things, and I can outline those, but the idea of the minimal facts argument, and you mentioned 12 of them earlier. Actually, I use 6 facts and a second fact 6, which aren't minimal facts, but they're very close, for a total of 12. That started while I was doing my dissertation. And let me tell you how the minimal facts thing started.
Yeah.
Started because my professors at Michigan State, I had a couple professors who believed in the resurrection, but I had a couple of very, very, left-wing professors, and they would tolerate whatever I was doing if I could defend something, but they didn't believe what I was saying. So I had to be very careful what I said. When my dissertation committee accepted my subject on the resurrection, as we were leaving, one of the more liberal members of the committee said to me, as we walked out the door, he said, "We're liberal at Michigan State, but we're good liberal." And I'm thinking, what does good liberal mean? He said, "Good liberal is we will give you a PhD if you defend well what you do. We do not have to agree with you. You
Fair.
defend it well, you got your PhD." And I always remembered that. So I sat down and I was trying to make my arguments. Like I said, that was Boltzmann's heyday. He died that same year I graduated, and I had to answer, let's just pick one out. The legend theory. Does all come from Greek myth? I sat there. I remember the chair I was in. I remember where the light was positioned. And I sat there and I said, if I am writing this for guys who do not believe the Bible is the New Testament is even reliable, how can I get my point across? And I made a list of facts that could be backed up without citing F.F. Bruce's little book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, which is the go-to reliability book in those days. And if I don't cite reliability, because they're not going to give it to me no matter what. They don't think the New Testament is reliable. They still don't. But what facts can I do according to their ways of arguing? So I learned the liberal way of arguing. I can think much easier as a liberal than I can as a conservative, because that's what I did for my whole life, my doubts and my schooling. And I came up with this list that even Boltzmann would accept. And if Boltzmann accepts them, everybody accepts them, So that was the beginning of the minimal facts argument. And it just evolved from there. My whole dissertation is, if we only know these data. Now, how have I changed? When I was writing in the 70s, I could not mention bodily appearances. Not because I didn't believe them, but because everybody thought they were stupid. You could, except for the real conservative New Testament guys, you could teach Jesus was really raised from the dead. That's fine. But say he was resurrected like Paul on Damascus. He was a glorified person who was there in the room with you, and we couldn't stare at him with our eyes when we appeared. So I had to kind of work with that. Paul was the hero in the New Testament. They don't like the Gospels. They still don't. Paul was in, Paul's still in. So today, if you're going to make an argument, you use Paul. All the most sophisticated arguments use Paul. And then you bring the Gospels in when and where you can. But you bring them in according to their criteria, because it's their university and it's the way they do theology and stuff. So I would say the biggest thing I have added starting in the 80s and 90s was filling out my Jesus really appeared with one word. He really appeared bodily. And I started emphasizing bodily after I got out of Michigan State and I was free to make up my own theory. Then Tom Wright's book comes along in 2003, and he argues what I call, I made Bill Craig laugh his head off when I said this one time. I said, Tom Wright has written the longest word study in history, because his word study on anastasis and egero, the two Greek words, is over 500 pages long. And if you don't know what those two words mean after 500 pages, and here's Tom. Tom says, it's bodily, bodily, bodily. He calls it he has different words for immortality, but he calls it physicality, resurrected physicality, he calls it.
Mm.
And so Jesus is raised bodily. And all of a sudden, here's a hero, Tom Wright, who dares to say, I could give you other ones. Gundry, not Stan
Yeah.
Gundry, but his brother, Bob Gundry, Mike Licona. They're arguing for body. That's a big change for me. Um, Forgetting about Buddhism, because at that time I
Okay.
was fighting Buddhism. I
Okay.
went past that. I think maybe today the biggest positive change is if you ask me what are the best evidences for the resurrection, in my mind, people in evangelicalism, by and large, would not understand my three top choices. They're not the normal ones we give, um, but they're ones that will stand the strongest critical objections. So that's changed. What I would say the best they're all New Testament and they're from Paul, but no argument there. It's just they would go, "What? You think that's the strongest?" Yeah, well, what are you going to use? The Gospel of John? Yeah, well, you'll be laughed out of court if you do that. So
Okay.
you have to do your own path when you're going down to people who don't like the material.
Okay, so don't lay out those three arguments right now. We're going to come to your 12 facts soon.
Okay.
But I have to ask, what would you just consider those three strongest facts? I know everybody's wondering that at this point. What would those arguments be without laying them
All
out?
right, so say them but don't explain them, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a tie between 1 and 2, but there's a little edge on
Okay.
1. By far, the strongest argument in my mind is an argument that virtually every critical scholar accepts, even atheist New Testament scholars. And that's in Galatians chapter 1 and in Galatians chapter 2. Notice it's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
Mm.
After Paul is converted, which everybody dates to 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion, so it's 32 to 33, if you think of 30 AD crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
32 to 33, Paul's converted. And he specifically says in Galatians 1, 3 years later, I went up to
Mm.
Jerusalem and I spent 2 weeks, 15 days, with Peter, and I didn't see any other apostles except James. So Peter and James. Now, you know, what's the first thing you're going to ask Peter and James if you're Paul? I'll just give you my first question for them if I'm Paul. Hey, I've heard you guys saw the risen Jesus, and you probably heard I have. I don't want to hear rumors anymore. I want you guys to tell me what the risen Jesus looked like to you, and then I'll tell you what the risen Jesus looked like to me. That would be my first question. How can you get around the gospel? So, and in chapter 2, where Paul goes back to Jerusalem, Galatians 2, first 10 verses, it specifically says we discuss the definition of the gospel.
Mm.
And Paul defines that as the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But later in the New Testament, the gospel is the deity, death, and resurrection. Burial is not always there. Deity, death, resurrection. So now I know they discussed it in his 2 trips to Jerusalem. And critics like to say, we have Paul's account, and Paul's an eyewitness, but we have no other eyewitnesses of the other appearances. And I go, except that Paul interviewed Peter and James, and they were eyewitnesses, and they discussed the gospel. And even Bart Ehrman says, he says, where do we get closer to the eyewitnesses than right here? So I'm going to say Jerusalem, number 1. Close second is an argument that when I gave it to my PhD students just a few years ago, they said, I'm halfway through my program. How come I've never even heard this argument before? Because it's so hot and it's been around for a long time, but didn't make its way through the numbers of scholars. The creedal argument. There's early
Mm.
creeds in the New Testament, dozens of them. Most of them are in Paul, but they're in the epistles, very rarely in the Gospels, very rarely. But they're usually in the epistles. The best known one is 1 Corinthians 15, some say 3 to 5, and some say 3 to 7. But that list of appearances is the most famous one. And virtually every scholar today is going to admit that some are most likely, well, most, and maybe even all, they date in the 30s AD. The creeds date in the 30s. So when someone says, how can you believe John? And they'll pick the latest one, right, just to make a bad point. John is plus 65 at 95 AD. He's 65 years later. How good a source is that? Well, I'll answer that. Better than any other religion has.
Mm.
65 better than the other one. But I'll go with the creeds from the 30s. That's number 2. Number 3, a little bit of a lag between 2 and 3, but 3 is still good. The so-called criteria for the New Testament.
Mm.
And Believers know these. We use them all the time and probably don't even know we use them. Criteria would be things like this. Do you have eyewitnesses? Do you have early sources? Do you have enemy attestation? Do you have multiple attestation? Um, you know, multiple attestations are biggie because that's two heads are better than one. And Bart Ehrman, just to give you an example, allows 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years. That's a period he uses for fair history. 100 years, 15 sources for Jesus, for the crucifixion. Well, that's a lot of evidence for the crucifixion. So that's how you use the criteria. It's the things that historians use, Testament scholars use to verify texts. So when you verify a text in the Gospels, how do you know it's true? That was written way later. Well, let me tell you why. As John Meyer might say, I can find 4 criteria that back up that fact. If that's true, that's a fact. So I'd say criteria number 3.
That's super interesting and helpful. Now, I have 2 broad questions before we jump into your 12 minimal facts, and you can just kind of lay out the case here. But you had an extensive section on the historical Jesus, that Jesus existed. 2-part question. Why don't you include the existence of Jesus as a minimal fact? And what would you say is the state of mythicism as a reputable position, at least as it's viewed within the academy?
Okay, if I take the second one first, you mean by mythicism or the mythicists. This would be people who say Jesus didn't or probably didn't ever exist.
Yes.
Well, let me cite Bart Ehrman and a number of other people, Morris Casey, who have written books on this. Totally out to lunch is the theory that totally out to lunch is the theory that the New Testament copied off ancient Greek mythology. What Bultmann said was gospel truth in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and died 76. Today, almost nobody believes it. In fact, one recent scholar who does believe it says I'm one of 3 in the whole world. So almost nobody believes it's an ancient myth. They're going to rely on Paul and do something like what I said, the creeds, the criteria. That's how they're going to make historical Jesus. Historical Jesus is in today, but the Jesus never lived view, which is they copied off Greek mythology and so on. Bart Ehrman goes off on it for 20 pages in his book on Did Jesus Exist? And he says some really tough things. He says, y'all who believe Jesus didn't live, there isn't a scholar among you. And then he says, well, there's a couple. He says you have a couple with good credentials, but very, very few. Most of you don't have any good reasoning. And he said, some of you, your laughers for Jesus never, your arguments for Jesus never lived, he calls them laughers. He calls them jokes. And he said, y'all who self-publish your own books and have never been to school and don't have degrees and you call yourself experts, he says, you wonder why we don't quote you. He says, you're surprised you haven't made inroads into us. And Bart says, you haven't got a foothold in our group. You don't even have a toehold. Nobody cares what you say. So those who think Jesus never lived, they talk to themselves, and they're very influential today. But there's almost not a scholar. There are a few very good scholars, but not very many.
Okay. Fair enough. Why is it not a minimal fact? Just kind of quick answer. It seems like an obvious fact that meets your criteria.
That what is?
That Jesus existed.
Oh, because the minimal facts apply only to death and resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, that's the focus of them. Okay, got it.
Yeah, if I wanted a lot of guys, a lot of major guys have done what I call minimal facts, but they've done them for Jesus' whole life. And that's how the guys in the Third Quest do an historical Jesus book, is by applying this kind of thing to all 33, however many years.
Okay, that's great. Obvious point. Not sure how I missed it. Let's keep going. One more question for you, though, is this is jumping ahead somewhat to your second volume where you're going to talk about naturalistic hypotheses. But you kind of point forward to that, describing how there's not a lot of scholars today who just take one hypothesis, the swoon theory, the wrong tomb theory, hallucinations. Rather, it's more of a worldview resistance in terms of naturalism. So Bart Ehrman has made this argument that philosophically, historians cannot even investigate the miraculous. It's outside of the discipline of history. Seems to me I have one of two options. Either to say no, historians can investigate it, or we can't do it strictly by history, but we can still know it by other means. Which route do you take, or a third route, and why?
Okay, I take a little bit of both. I actually agree with Bart Ehrman in part. Now, my research assistant, by contrast, Ben Shaw, who's got a PhD, did his dissertation on the resurrection. He did his resurrection on this. He did his dissertation on this question: can a historian, qua historian, conclude that the resurrection happened?
Wow.
Mike Licona and I are on his committee. We're like Michigan State. Ben, you can get away with whatever you can defend, even if we disagree with you. Ben disagrees a bit with both of us. He thinks an historian can say Jesus was raised from the dead. I say, he should be able to, kind of on the fence. I'm a little bit close to Ehrman here. But you're right. The other view is still true. A lot of historians will say, I can't do it. I'm an historian. Talk to my theologian or philosopher buddy. See, they give you the path to go to. And I don't care if historians can't find the answer, but philosophers and theologians can. We're still going to get the defense of the resurrection. So I'd say both. I'm a little bit skeptical of what an historian can tell you according to his or her training. But the fact that there's other scholars, my PhD is in history and philosophy of religion. People know me as fitting into philosophy departments. I could just as easily have been a member of the history department because it's history of religion, philosophy of religion is what I did my PhD on. And my dissertation was in history. And I had to satisfy all three departments at Michigan State: history, philosophy, and religion. So
Wow.
I kind of agree with that. But as long as you can get there, I don't care what your area is. If you can get to the resurrection, I'm happy with you.
Good stuff. Well, let's jump into the 12 facts. And let's start with the first one that is one of the minimal facts. And you say, Jesus died due to the effects of Roman crucifixion. Now, you walk through the historical and the medical and the enemy attestation, multiple attestation of this. We don't have to walk through some of that's been laid out. But what struck me as most interesting is you had this in-depth, I don't remember how many pages it is, where you were studying the different medical doctors' opinions about how Jesus died. I had always leaned towards asphyxiation, but never done the deep dive and always wanted to. When I saw this, I was like, awesome, Gary has done this. So maybe catch us up to speed a little bit about how most doctors view Jesus dying by crucifixion and why.
Why they take that view?
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple years ago, Ben Shaw, again, my research assistant, and I teamed up with a fellow named Jonathan Koppel. Jonathan is an MD, PhD from Texas Tech, I believe, and he's a neurologist. So we got a good guy there, good medical doctor, and the three of us did an article that was published by the Baylor University Medical Journal. And we're not trying to prove what Jesus died of. All we're doing is doing a landscape of medical doctors who answer this. And there are more medical doctors or medical specialists who, see, you can be a PhD in medical school. You don't have to be an MD. You could be a chemist and be teaching medical school. So people who do medicine with earned doctorates, there are more, or about the same number of doctors in our study who think that the death by crucifixion is death by asphyxiation than all the other half dozen possibilities put together. In fact, there's more who believe asphyxiation than double the rest of the half dozen put together. That doesn't make it right. It allows us to say the majority of the views in the published medical literature is that Jesus died by death by asphyxiation. That's the most common medical view, and not every doctor feels that they can just start out and write a paper on. They got to be an historian then to do something on the crucifixion. So
how much do you think How much do you think that medical case adds to our confidence that Jesus died by crucifixion?
How much depends on the fact that he died by asphyxiation?
No, how much does the medical case that's put forward by these doctors add to the historical case of him dying by crucifixion? Because for me, I've typically laid out there's non-Christian sources, there's multiple attestation. I've said the medical evidence is interesting and adds to it. It's like another layer, but not the core of it. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very good, Sean. Just citing Bart Ehrman. Why would an atheist New Testament scholar give us 15 independent writers from 100 years after the cross. 100, by the way, they're inside the New Testament, they're outside the New Testament. 15 independent sources that say Jesus died by crucifixion. That's pretty good historical evidence to go along with the. But in that medical article with the Baylor Medical Journal, we argue at the end. We're not saying asphyxiation has to be the route. And by the way, it's asphyxiation, not suffocation. There's a distinction between the words, and even medical doctors flip the words around.
Hmm.
But asphyxiation, what I'm told is asphyxiation is when you die by something's not working internally. You've got a bad case of asthma, you've got pneumonia, you've got
Huh.
but the other view is when someone puts a pillow over your face or a plastic bag over your head.
Interesting.
It's induced. But asphyxiation is in you. And that's a predominant view. Now, in Jesus' case, they did things to him, right? They hung him and they stabbed him, but he could still breathe. So until he couldn't breathe anymore, and then it's asphyxiation. So that's the most common view. But we end the article and we say we are not saying that this has to be a death by asphyxiation. It looks like it is from the majority. We can't go majority, but a lot of doctors have a lot of reasons. We think it's probably asphyxiation, but our theory does not rely on that. It relies on two other bits of evidence. One is a series of Roman arguments. For example, a Roman writer says that when the family wanted to get their family member down off the cross, the centurion who thinks he's dead, he says this guy's dead. Family says, "Can we take the body and bury it?" He goes, "Just a minute." They take the body off the cross. They stab the body with the spear to make sure the body is doubly dead. And now, family members, take it away. And they take it. So this Roman source, and there's other ones, they break ankles. By the way, that's a good reason. Why do you break ankles if it's not asphyxiation? You go, oh, just to be mean. No. Why is it always break an ankle? You can throw a rock at his head. I mean, why break ankles? Because when a person is down and can't pull up, you can't. If your life depends on pull-ups, you're not living very long. Nobody is. So if they break your ankles, that tells me something's happening with your breathing. But it doesn't have to be that. One is the Roman sources. We have historical sources, 15 independent sources. The Roman source stabbed him with the spear. The second reason is the most powerful one of all. It beats medicine. And it was raised by David Strauss in the mid-19th century. It's called Strauss's Critique. But this guy was, I don't know, a fundamentalist pastor would call him a reprobate. He was the liberal in the 19th century. He was famous for introducing what became Bultmann's views in the 20th century, mythology. He did not believe anything about Jesus, and he died a disillusioned man who rejected a conservative, orthodox view of God and the afterlife, which were the marks of liberals. He rejected them both, and yet he said this. He says, there's some jokers in our time who think Jesus didn't die on the cross. It was the most popular view when he started writing. He said, that view is a joke. He said, think about it. If you crucify this guy and you put him in the grave for a few days, I don't care, make it a week, make it 2 weeks, I don't know, what's he going to look like when he comes out? Now, because I have for a lot of people, a very nasty hobby, all my life I've gone snake hunting. I've caught hundreds of snakes and I've been bitten hundreds of times. By harmless snakes. I did get bit once by a rattlesnake, but it doesn't matter. So because I'm snake hunting, I stepped on a lot of nails out in the woods when you're turning things over. And I'm going to tell you, when you step on a nail, number one, you don't keep your foot on that nail very long, like less than a second. And you can't walk for 2 or 3 days. Now, if Jesus is on a big spike for a long time and you expect him to walk and you beat him up first, and if you stab him with a spear, what's he going to look like when he appears? This is David Strauss. What does he look like when he appears to disciples? We used to have a phrase in the 60s. I don't know if anybody uses it today, but we used to call it death warmed over. You look like death warmed over this morning. Jesus would have looked like death warmed over, getting off. What's he look like? He's struggling. He can't stand up. He leans against the doorpost. He's sweating. He's bleeding. He's soaked. He's soaked his clothes with sweat and with blood, and he knocks on the door. And he tells the disciples, guys, I told you I would rise again from the dead. I think they'd look at each other and go, who did this joke? And I think Peter would go, Andrew, get a bowl. Mary, get some water. Get us some rags. This me needs help. Get over here and lay on the couch. Okay. What the swoon theory that Jesus never died, or the apparent death theory, what it
Mm-hmm.
proves is that Jesus was alive, but he was not raised. That's what comes from, if you want to say he faked death, the argument is, congratulations, you got a living Jesus. Now, where does that get you? Because he's not, they're not dumb. They
Hmm.
know enough to know this guy isn't ready to go to heaven and sing with the angels. He's in bad
Of
shape. And then where
course.
does he?
Of course.
That's the number one reason. Asphyxiation is helpful. The Roman sources are great. The multiple sources are great. But Strauss's critique historically since about 1864, it has been the end of the swoon theory. Scholars still today say Strauss killed the apparent death theory.
Wow.
That's the reason. That's the reason to be sure Jesus was dead. He couldn't pull it off otherwise.
Strauss killed the theory, pun intended, of course.
There
And
you
I
go.
agree with you.
There you
That's
go.
a strong
I
critique.
say
Now,
that.
your
I
minimal
say
facts,
pun intended. I like that.
your minimal facts have two criteria. Number one, about 90% of scholarly support and belief, plus very good evidential support. And you emphasize it's more about the evidential support. It's not just a majority type of argument. Now,
Yeah.
Jesus dying by crucifixion, if we added presumably Muslim scholars, that would drop this way below 90%, right? Because of Surah 4, which says he was crucified not, only appeared to do so. Now,
Yeah.
some will adopt, like certain sects of Islam will take the swoon theory. Some will say they made somebody appear to. But wouldn't that
Yeah.
completely change the first fact?
No. Now, first of all, to make clear, I never say anywhere, people cite me, but I never say anywhere that you have to have 90 percentile of the scholars. It just turns out that it's more like 95, but I don't require that. It's just that
Okay.
everybody allows this. Okay. Secondly, no, the Muslim theory does not change this one iota. And
Hmm.
here's why. You go, well, what do you mean? Look how many scholars they have, and look how many scholars, and they have degrees too. Okay, here's the problem. What is their source, and why do they hold this? It's the Quran. When was the Quran written? Well, if we can believe the conservative Muslim view, 630 AD, it was left. And when was Jesus crucified? 30 AD. So, real simple math, the Quran comes 600 years later. Nobody, nobody else thinks that a source 600 years later can tell you what happened 600 years earlier.
Hmm.
It's the source. Listen, over here on my shelf, I've got a book by a Muslim scholar, and he says the Christians are going to say that comes from your book, and your book is 600 years later. You can't do history 600 years later. And the author actually says they're right.
Huh.
Whoa. And then he says, but when they say that to me, let me tell you my response. The Gospels have so many errors in it. Okay, let's put these two against each other. You guys are right. The Quran is not a history book. You can't, I mean, and not in the sense that you can refute the crucifixion
Sure.
with it. It's too late. But you guys have a lot of errors in the Gospels. Here's what they don't understand. If they don't allow a source from 600 years later, they've got nothing. But what about that you guys have errors? That's why I did the minimal facts. Everybody at Michigan State and most scholars today believe the New Testament's full of errors. Minimal facts works around the errors. Let me give you just a goofy illustration. I saw a magician one time up on a stage, and this woman crawls into a box, and he puts a lot of swords through the box, and then she stands up and walks out. Then he let us all come up and look at what happened. She's in the box, but because she's really limber, she twisted her body along this preformed line, and the swords went into other categories. My point is, she missed the path of the. I don't care how many errors you think there are in the Bible. I'm going to use facts that everybody allows, even atheist New Testament scholars. So obviously, the reason discrepancies don't touch these facts. I'm using the ones for which there are no discrepancies. And if I can still get a resurrection, the worst thing I could have, this is the worst. This is not me. You got to remember I teach at Liberty University. The worst thing you would have is a Swiss cheese New Testament where Jesus still is the Son of God who died on the cross for our sins and rose from the dead. It's a little Swiss cheese because they find critics problems. We still have the gospel and we're still going to heaven and the gospel's still true. So that guy's saying the Quran can't refute 30 AD. He's totally right. But when he does errors, everybody does errors. It does not refute these key facts. I mean, does anybody think Bart Ehrman thinks there's no errors in Scripture? Bart Ehrman says not even reliable. Well, why does he admit all my facts? Because they're facts. That's why.
All
Sorry
right,
for
good
the long explanation.
response. No, that's
I
great.
mean, you
That's
remember, when you've been doing this for decades, you learn your kind of, just like that woman in the box, you learn your way around these things.
no, I love it. That's great. Well, let's shift to the next one. You said
Okay.
Jesus was buried most likely in a private tomb. So, what's kind of the basic case for the burial and the consensus on this? And it seems like this has changed, hasn't it, over the years?
Yeah, but remember, burial is not one of my minimal facts. Burial is one of the second six. Maybe we should name them real fast so that people know. Because my minimal facts start with Jesus died by crucifixion. And
Okay.
the very next one is the disciples had experiences that they believed to be appearances of the risen Jesus. I don't even count the empty tomb, because the empty tomb, there's as
Mm-hmm.
many evidence for the empty tomb as there is for any fact, but scholars don't like it, so I put it in my second six.
Okay.
A burial is way in the second six. I think it's good. The evidence for the burial is good, but it's not one of my six facts. So I go from Jesus died by crucifixion to the disciples thought they saw him again. That's number two. And that,
Mm-hmm.
by the way, is not only the most important fact for us that they saw him walking and talking after he died on the cross. It's not that's the most central, but it's also the strongest. Along with the crucifixion and that he was seen afterwards are the two strongest. I'll tell you this: of all the appearances in the uh, well, mostly all gospels, you got Paul, but and you got James, but of the appearances to Christ, keep these two things in mind. Most of them are to groups. That's
Mm-hmm.
really important. Most of them are to groups. And secondly, the strongest appearance is the appearance to the 12. It's multiply attested over and over. And even the Jesus Seminar, critics that they are, even Bar Ehrman, even Dom Crossan, who I just got an email from while I'm sitting here talking to you, even Dom Crossan, all these guys will say that they're not questioning the crucifixion at all. They allow it, and they allow that there were multiple reports of group appearances. By the way, here's a citation. Talk about Dom Crossan. This is pretty close to a quote. Uh, Crossan says, "I take it absolutely for granted
Mm.
that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I take it absolutely for granted."
That's awesome.
Marcus Borg, another one from the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borg, says almost the exact same thing. Quote, Bart Ehrman, 15 sources. So that and the appearances are a 1-2 punch.
Okay, so let's walk through. There's a list in the book where you list the 12 together, but not necessarily in the order of the 6 minimal facts and then the 6 attested facts. It's more like you list them kind of step by step chronologically in the life of Jesus, even though they're all
Well,
more
they're
telling
not.
the story of Jesus, so to speak.
Well, they're not mixed. In my table of contents, I'll do it this way. If you probably have it right there. In the table of contents, I have the 6 minimal facts. If I can turn the page, let me get my glasses. In the table of contents, I have the minimal historical facts as part 3,
Okay.
and then halfway down, I mean, you see these other facts. The next one is the other 6 known historical facts. So 6 plus 6 equals 12. Notice burial is in the second list. The
Gotcha.
first 6, if you just want me to say them,
Yeah,
the
say the
first
first
6,
6.
we've done 2.
Yep.
Jesus died. They thought he appeared. The disciples' lives were totally transformed. And you always say, man, you've written the best book on this. Um, we always say, don't ever say you can prove the disciples died for their faith. That's
I
bogus. I
agree.
mean, you can go a long way, but you have to use sources that are not as late as the Muslim source to the New Testament, but they're late on the New Testament. So always say the disciples are willing to die for their faith. That means the disciples are transformed. And as you say in your book, there's no evidence that anybody recanted. So that's great. The
Mm.
transformations. It was proclaimed. I skipped one. The resurrection was proclaimed very early. Early and transformations happened at the same time. That's the
Okay.
creedal evidence. And then the last 2 are James and Paul.
Got it.
Burial's not there. Empty tomb. Now, when you turn the page and you see the other 6, empty tomb is 1, burial is 1, etc.
Okay, so folks, so they can hear this, your minimal facts are Jesus died by crucifixion, no debate about that. The disciples reported experiences they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Number
No
two.
dispute about that. That the
Number
disciples thought they saw appearances is not disputed.
Good. Third one is they proclaim the resurrection early, right after their experiences. So like you
Yes.
saying, we'll come back to this. There's no early non-resurrection gospel that was proclaimed. Fourth is the transformation in their lives to the willingness
Yes.
to die. And then James
Yes.
and Paul, those are the six. Okay,
Yeah.
let me come back to the second one here. You said the disciples
Yeah.
report experiences they thought were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, here's
But
where some debate.
They thought they were appearances.
They thought they were. Now, here's where some debate comes in, that we have the testimony of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, one of the accepted letters, 3 accounts in Acts, strong historical case can be made for this. Few people question Paul. Few people question Peter. We have multiple accounts of Peter singled and named out. But when it comes to the other 12, now they're just mentioned as a group, not mentioned as individuals. So how much confidence can we have in, say, James, the son of Zebedee, or Matthew, or Thaddeus, who's not specifically mentioned, and we don't have his direct eyewitness claim that he saw the risen Jesus?
I say 2 things. Number one, the way I will nuance that claim of disciples' transformations, I will say, as far as we know and all the literature we have,
Okay.
it's positive. But here's the more important one. There's 4 big names in the early research. You've named everybody but one and are talking here. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and John. They're the 4 most influential Christians probably of all time. And when Paul goes to Jerusalem to talk to the eyewitnesses, this is my number one reason, remember, he sees Peter and James and Paul. 3 of the 4 are there. And when he comes back in Galatians 2, John is there. And in Galatians 2:2, which basically all scholars except critics, 2:2, Paul laid on the table the gospel he preached. And he says right after that, they added nothing to me. They added nothing. So the gospel's the same. I mean, the gospel teaching is the same. And a few verses later, verses 9 and 10, they gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship. So, okay, now who did? At least Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. We have them. Okay, if they're the big 4, Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John, if they're the most influential ones, we have first century martyrdom reports on 3 of the 4. And I know you reject the second century one for John. But a lot of people think John's the only one that, nothing ever happened to him. But we have a second century report. You can do what you want with that. But we have Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. We have first century witnesses and later. But we have them as early as the first century to their martyrdoms. So I say at least those guys. And you go, what about the rest of them? I say it's irrelevant to me. There's 4 here. We can track them. 3 of them died, and the rest of them are willing to. And now they go, how do you know they're willing? Do you read their minds? I love this when they say that. I think they walk into a trap. Can you read their minds? How do you know they're willing to die? I'll say I don't read their minds. I read their feet. When you go back into a city over and over and over again, or you go in the same geographic area where you're beat up and left for dead just a walking distance away, guess what? You're more interested in proclaiming your truth than you are about your life. So they're willing to die. But I make a big deal of Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. And if you want to use John, if you don't want to use John, they're the 4 that are in Galatians 1 and 2. Only the first 3 are in Galatians 1. And notice why that's why those guys are in the minimal facts.
That makes sense. Now,
and that's why I think it's the best evidence for the resurrection, those 2 trips to Jerusalem.
So what's interesting when it comes to the other apostles, another potential angle here is when you look at the beginning of Acts, they lay out the names specifically. In Acts chapter 1, it says Peter and John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, Simon, Judas the son of James. They're specifically mentioned by name. And then Peter stands up and he's going to lead and speak on behalf of the apostles. and he says, we are witnesses of these things. So
Yep.
we don't have as strong of a case for the appearance to, say, Thomas as we do to, say, Peter, but his name is mentioned there.
Right.
Like, I'm not willing to just completely give up with it and say we don't have an adequate historical case. It's a good historical case, just not as strong as Paul and Peter.
How about a couple other hints to get there? In that same list that you give, that the apostles are there, it says Mary and the boys were there, and it says Mary and James were there. So someone says, when did James become a Christian? I'll go, I don't think anybody knows, but here's a couple parameters for you. At the cross, if you can believe John gives, John says Jesus told his mother to go home with John. Now, and they go, why not James? Well, I don't think James was present at the cross. I think that can be kind of clear. I'm thinking chances are James isn't a Christian yet, but he's there shortly after the ascension. So I think James's conversion happens a little bit between the cross and that upper room that you just mentioned, because James is there. And we have an account, it's not trustworthy, but we have an account from about 125 AD where Jesus appears to James. That is recorded in the Gospel of the Hebrews. Jesus appears to his brother. So I think James comes in there, and he's there too. And also notice in that first chapter in Acts, we have to pick a 12th disciple because Judas died. So we have to pick a witness who's been with us from the beginning, and he has to be a witness of the resurrection. Then Peter winds up and he preaches the first Christian sermon post-Jesus. And in Acts 2:22, he uses the argument that nailed me way back with my German pastor when Peter says in Acts 2:22, Jesus is a man approved among you. How do you know he was approved? Next two verses. The miracles he did, including he was raised from the dead. So Peter preaches in his first sermon that the resurrection of Jesus indicates that Jesus' teachings are true, and that's why God raised him. So we have everything right there. And if you say to me, well, we don't have an appearance to Thaddeus, okay, I have a second reason for you. You're right on the first one. We have that list in Acts 1. Here's the second one. I've already said it, but I'll repeat it. The best evidence of the appearances to the 12. All the apostles are there in the beginning. What if somebody fell away later? What if they didn't? Well, what if they did? What if they didn't? See, this argument's going nowhere, but we don't have any data, as you say. I'll quote Sean McDowell. As you say, we have no evidence of recanting, neither in the New Testament or in the early reliable sources, nothing. But I concentrate on Paul, Peter, and James, for which we have outstanding data. Hey, one thing we should admit, Sean, in Acts, there are a lot of creeds. And in Acts, though, they're called sermon summaries. And they're primarily found in Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13, and 17. If you go back and look at those, and every one, the gospel's given, the resurrection's present in every one. It's the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Acts 1 through 5. So I would tell my PhD students this, if you ask a conservative, how do you know what happened in the earliest church after the Gospels? Oh, easy. Read the book of Acts. You ask a liberal, how do you know what happened? Read the book of Acts. What? You guys don't agree, do you? No way. What's the evangelical say? I take the whole book of Acts. What's the liberal say? I use the sermon summaries. I use the creeds. But you still get
it's
the
still
data.
In there.
That's the value of the creeds.
Mm-hmm. That's really a great point from Acts 1 when they're replacing an apostle for Judas. Two criteria: been with Jesus since the beginning of his ministry and a witness to his resurrection. That assumes the very names listed there at the beginning of Acts were a part of the 12 and were also witnesses to the resurrection. So not as strong as Peter giving his own account, but that's a strong historical record we can't simply dismiss. All right, so
we have Peter giving his own account in Galatians 1 and 2 as told by Paul, and the critics think Paul is reliable. By the way, along with Galatians 1 and 2, you've got maybe the strongest verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 11. He's talking about all the people who saw Jesus, and he's got two groups. He's got three groups, but the 12, a group called all the apostles, and a group of 500. And after he talks about the apostles seeing Jesus in verse 11, extremely important verse, he says, whether it is them He just got done talking about the apostles. Whether it's them or whether it's me, so we preach, and so you believe. We have Paul saying, I don't know if he means all 12. He didn't say all 12. I'm not going to die for that. But he did say the disciples, more than just three, were running around preaching the resurrection. And here's the important point, that they were preaching the same thing. Paul and the disciples are eyewitnesses, and that's why Galatians 1 and 2 are so powerful. They're just
Good stuff.
The argument goes like this. Boom. It all just fits right in together like this. That you got the creeds and the Acts sermon summaries, everything.
So Jesus died by crucifixion, minimal fact. Second, the apostles had experiences they believed were of the risen Jesus. The third minimal fact is the proclamation of the resurrection appearances took place very early after the experiences. Now, I had to spend a lot of time on this in my dissertation because if the apostles were willing to suffer and die, I had to show that that belief was tied to the resurrection. So you laid out in your chapter even more detail than I laid out in my own study. But what are just some of the basic facts why we know there is no early Christian faith apart from the resurrection, and the resurrection isn't some kind of late mythical add-on to this movement that was already taking place?
Right. Two ways. That last part first. Scholars don't believe there were add-ons. They don't believe they brought in, well, Christians could have made one up, but they didn't get one from any other foreign religion or Hellenistic stuff, because there's dying, rising gods in the ancient world too. They don't think Christians copied the three guys. The main guy who's talking and says, I'm one of three guys who believe these theories. I understand from one of his students he's a Christian. Number two, he believes it doesn't touch the resurrection. So they just think there's stories out there. They don't relate them. That's one. But what was your first question here just before how do we know the resurrection is central? Because whenever the gospel is defined in the New Testament, it's not death, burial, resurrection, which we say oftentimes, but burial's not there probably more than half the time. It's deity of Christ, death, and resurrection. You go, whoa, time out. How do you get deity of Christ? Because of the names they use. And Lord, just to take one, Lord in the New Testament, a lot of books being written on this. Lord in the New Testament is there's several words for Lord, but the major word for Lord is the Old Testament equivalent of Jehovah. Guess who Lord is? Well, he could be Lord of the Manor. Yeah, well, Jehovah wasn't Lord of the Manor. So if you're going to use the name of Jehovah, here's a great example. Creed. This is Creed. We cite Paul, but it's Creed. Romans 10:9. If we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now notice, deity, resurrection, death. That's the way it happens in that verse. Just right after that, Paul tells you what he means by Lord. And he quotes Joel. Whoever calls upon the Lord will be saved. Whoever calls upon the Lord is Paul's verse for what Lord means. And Lord there is Jehovah. So, deity, death, and resurrection are all there. Someone says, it's a tack on. It is? Well, then how come every time the gospel is repeated, it's always deity, death, resurrection? You get the point after a while? Deity, death, resurrection. Don't leave resurrection out. What's 1 Corinthians 15 say? You leave the resurrection out, we have nothing. By the way, center, I think the fact that in my dissertation, I have empty tomb and burial are part of the original 6, and I have 4 more. One of them is centrality. And I could move it up in the minimal fact. Center could be up there. Virtually nobody says that the resurrection wasn't a central doctrine. But my question would be, if someone says it's not, how come it's in the gospel every single time the gospel is preached, in the book of Acts and in the epistles of Paul in particular? It's there.
I think your section is powerful and extensive, as I've seen, from their creeds that predate the New Testament, the writings of Paul, the Gospels, the preaching in the book of Acts, the early church fathers. I mean, there's no layer I could find that's absent of the resurrection.
Again, it's like this.
Exactly. I think it makes sense that that's minimal fact. Now, we talked about the evidence of James you hinted at. One of the objections is that we have James who... we don't really know it was the appearance of Jesus that converted him. Now, you cited earlier that we have the account in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and then we have kind of what's called the Gospel of Hebrews, I think is the title, mid-2nd century, that has kind of an appearance to James. Now,
which is only, it's only a fragment. It's only a
It's
fragment, but the appearance of James is there. Yes.
so it's multiply attest. I know Crossan goes for a third source and maybe the Gospel of Thomas 12, but I'm
Thomas.
not convinced by that. I don't think you are
I know
either.
it. I know it.
But
Gospel of Thomas 12 makes no sense to me at all.
hmm,
As back in the, hey, if it backs it up, it backs it up. But I don't care if Thomas backs it up. It's fine with me, but I don't see it in saying 12.
I agree. I'd like to be convinced by that, but I just didn't see that it was there. How do we know it was the resurrection appearance that converted James? Or if it's not what converted him, does that really ultimately matter for the strength of his conversion?
No. And what I would say is we learn of James's unbelief in three places minimum: Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7. In Mark 6, he and the other brothers seem to side with the townspeople who think Jesus is mentally ill. That's the Greek word there. The word for there could mean schizophrenia or out of their mind in some sense. And they're embarrassed. I assume the brothers are embarrassed because Jesus is bringing their good name down. For all we know, maybe they're carpenters and it's hurting their business. So they pulled Jesus aside. They didn't believe. Mark 6 again, they didn't believe. John 7 makes it real plain. For as yet they did not believe in Jesus. Then later, again, he's not at the cross. I think that's the fact that he's not at the cross, if he's a believer and even a good brother, why isn't he there? And but he's right after the upper room. So I don't know that the appearance did. We do have the Gospel of the Hebrews. But it looks like by far the best argument.
Okay.
However, I really don't care. The
Okay.
main point is James one of those who sees the risen Jesus? Is his life changed? We have Josephus saying he was basically the pastor in Jerusalem. He dies martyrdom in 62 AD, and a non-biblical, non-Christian writer tells us this source. And we have many other sources we could use, but I think Josephus is the one we would go to. Josephus writes, by the way, just about 25 years later. So,
Yeah.
and he's not a Christian. So we know James is part of that transformation group because he wasn't. Mark 3, Mark 6, John 2. Critics don't question that as a rule. You have two, Painter and Bauckham, both say he probably, that probably doesn't mean that. But that's a small minority of everybody. And then all of a sudden he's in the church. He's in there in the upper room after the ascension. And he and Peter are co-pastors in Jerusalem when Paul comes there for a visit. So I think James is not an issue. And Paul is so well known, you are not going to find even hardly a single scholar who's going to question Paul's conversion because he thought, remember
Wow.
all of them. The disciples saw, James saw, Paul saw. The rest of it's the same. They all saw what they thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus. That's not disputed. And Paul's
Okay.
our best witness.
So we
The
won't go
critic.
through all 6 of the other not minimal facts, but well-supported facts. But let me just come back to the one about the burial of Jesus, because
Yes.
there's been some prominent scholars like Crossan who have denied this, and I think more recently Bart Ehrman has kind of backtracked and said he doesn't accept the burial. Where is scholarship as a whole on this, and maybe what are just a few of the key historical points you think are so convincing that we can trust this account?
Okay, a lot of things to say here. Uh, First of all, yeah, you're right. Bart Ehrman has changed. He used to hold the private burial. How about the fact that we don't have any sources that tell us that Jesus was buried what's called a trench, a rectangle in the ground, and he was put there, and yeah, the dogs ate him, or he was thrown in the trash heap, Gehenna, in Jerusalem, and they burned him. No sources. Well, the comeback is that's what often happens with crucifixion victims. Yes and no. We have a source in Josephus that tells us that Jews were so particular about the resurrection of the body, as far as the trash heap is concerned, that they even buried people who capital punishment people. They buried them. Okay, well that could be in the ground. Okay, I was only answering the Gehenna thing, the trash heap, but there is more evidence for the tomb easily. Bill Craig has probably done the most on this, certainly one of them, who does an argument for Joseph of Arimathea had to be this, most likely it's this tomb. All the data we have link it to a man, Joseph, from the Sanhedrin, his tomb. There's many of them in Jerusalem, many. All right, you go, well, that's only 3 or 4 facts. How many do you have for he was thrown to the ground? Well, just that usually
Hmm.
occurred. No, you can't even use that because Josephus says they didn't treat them that way. So, but here's my biggest comeback on this. I think we're pretty solid because we have a lot of facts for the burial. But you got to be. I'm so used to arguing what I'm going to say next. If I'm in a
Okay.
little dialogue, I'm going to say, "I don't give a rip,"
All right.
and you go, "Why would you say that? It's gospel." I'm arguing for deity, death, resurrection of Jesus.
Sure.
Now, let me just make a point to show you. I would tell the critic, let me make a point to show you that right now, I don't, for all intent and purposes, for right now, if I'm talking about this at university, I don't care where he was buried. Let me make a point. If the disciples stole the body and moved him to Peter's living room and didn't know what to do with him, and he's wrapped up in a linen cloth on Peter's couch, he's not buried in any of the above things we've answered. Well, he took him out of the tomb. But what happens on Easter Sunday? Darn it, Jesus rises in Peter's living room. What I mean is, I don't. If they put him in a trench, if they put him in a tomb, if he's in a tomb but we don't know where it is, the most important point is, was he dead on the cross? Yes. And what happened
Hmm.
afterwards? He was seen. What's the best appearance? The 12. And most of the appearance accounts are group accounts. You know what? And I would say again, if I have a short time and I'm speaking at university, I got the crucifixion easy. I got the appearances easy. The best one is the 12. And you're going to try to slow me down and ask me what happened on the burial? Let's talk about the appearances. And that's why the minimal facts work so well. I think the evidence is very strong that he was buried in a private tomb in Joseph, because there's no facts to the contrary. I
Hmm.
mean, nothing substantial, but you know, beyond that, I don't use it. I care
That's
that
fair.
Jesus died and he was raised and seen. I mean,
The two facts in the burial that are interesting to me, of course, is that it's multiply attested, and that it
yeah,
would be embarrassing potentially to have somebody from the very group that condemned Jesus to death to give him this honorable burial, of course. That's an
and
interesting factor.
Joseph never corrects it. He doesn't
Yeah,
come out and say no, that there's no contrary. They're just a list of data for the burial, and I give some of it there in the book.
you
There's
do.
a list of data for the burial, but like I said, if he would rise from Peter's living room, he can certainly arise from a dirt trench in the ground.
Fair
I'm
enough.
interested. Not into Nothing in my faith depends on where
Yeah,
he was buried. Although I think it's good. I think you're right. Joseph is
yeah,
good, but I do want to know that he died and that he was seen by multiple people.
that makes sense. I do think it's remarkable, and we'll move on, that we have the name Joseph, we have where
Yep.
he's from, Arimathea, we
Yep.
have his financial status, obviously,
Yep.
the rich man's tomb, and his position that he held. I mean, these are not insignificant facts in Jerusalem that was smaller than people think. It'd be hard to make up something like this that's not true
How
and
about the
and get
fact
away
that
with it.
we, how about the fact that we have 4 gospels? Now, somebody's going to say, "Oh, the gospels are late sources." Well, yeah, they're later than the creeds and they're later than Paul. But you tell me who the earliest sources are for Krishna? 4,200 years later uh, for the Bhagavad Gita. 1,800 years later for the Upanishads. These other religions, Buddha. I got a Buddhist book on my shelf over here where the guy starts the book out and say, "We don't have any evidences like Christianity. Our earliest word statements of Buddhists are 600 to 800 years later," and then he makes this outstanding. He's a PhD professor in
Mm,
England. He says, "We don't know what Buddha taught. The sources are too late." By the way, they're still earlier than the Quran on the New Testament. But he says we don't know what he taught. So even the Gospels are early. And here's my point: those guys did not write those 4 Gospels in 4 bedrooms in the same house. They wrote them differently around the whole Mediterranean, and they all tell the same story of Josephus without looking over each other's shoulder. Uh, you said multiple attestation. You're exactly right. That's a very strong evidence that that's the story they all.
mm.
And the women go to the tomb. How embarrassing! Not the men. They were scared, but the women went. That's embarrassing testimony, which is a criteria. So this is again,
Well,
we're doing this stuff.
you took me exactly where I was hoping to go next on the empty tomb, which again is not part of your minimal facts, but it
Yep.
seems like you said your best estimate was about 80% of scholars agreed with this, if I read that right. But the
Yeah.
so has
You
there
put
been a
you
shift in acceptance of the empty tomb since like the 70s or even earlier?
Yeah. You opened. I have been criticized probably by critics more than anything else, I've been criticized for saying 75% of scholars believe in the empty tomb, which I said probably 20 years ago, 18, and I've said it since. That's because I did a survey. That's just my survey. I don't claim it's authoritative or anything. But um, in my surveys, 75%, well, sometimes I'll say, oh, two-thirds to three-quarters believed in it. But I did a new one for this book. I did a new survey of over 250 critical scholars, 250, and they have to have a terminal degree in a relevant field and have spoken on this subject. And now my figure this time, as you noted, it's moved from 67 to 75. It's gone up now to 80. It was like 80.2%. And I didn't doctor it to get that last percentage point. And the first time I divided it, it was 80.2%. We're now up to 80% for the empty tomb. We're getting close to making the scholarly acceptance put it up in the empty tomb, but I put up with the minimal facts. But if you look at about arguments, there's over 20 arguments for the empty tomb, according to critics' standards, which make it as well defended. If you get rid of that critical point, the second point of my minimal facts, first one is what the facts say. Empty tomb's up there with the other five. That's why I call it. Notice as I go further on in the book, I call it 6+1. I call it 6+1. The empty tomb is +1 because it doesn't pass my critical scholars test, but it more than passes the more important test of evidences. The empty tomb is as tough as it gets.
Now, probably, maybe my favorite part of your book, one of the top three, is that I remember you referencing years ago, maybe it was in Risen Jesus, Future Hope, you said there's about close to half a dozen arguments for the empty tomb. And I always thought, what are these arguments? Where are they? I'm not aware of them. And I get to the chapter here and I was like, yes, you laid out 21 of these arguments. Now, we're not going to walk through all 21 of them. People are going to have to go through your book. That would be an entire talk just within itself. But I'm curious what you think. Two-part question. We'll start with the first one. What do you think is maybe the two or couple best arguments for the empty tomb? And then I've got a follow-up question about some of the lesser-known ones that you now reference.
Now, in the material on the empty tomb, in the big book, because I've done this I got 22 other books on the resurrection. But what I'm saying is, people go, oh, and you put all 22 of them together to get this big one. Actually, there's no new material. I mean, there's no old material in this book. A very small amount where I took some paragraphs here and there, but this is all new material in the big book. But in my earlier works, I do give. I could tell you who the guys are, but somebody will give 8 arguments for the empty tomb. Somebody else gives 12, and the list keeps going. And I've got 20 in there, arguments for the empty tomb, but I differentiate. The first 6 to 8 are the best. The rest of them, from 8 on, are subsidiary arguments. They're helpers, not the original ones. Gotcha. So I think the best arguments for the empty tomb, I don't know how many you want me to give, but I'll give you 2 right off the bat, and you can push for more if you want.
That's great.
The 2 arguments right off the bat, the one critics think is number 1. And man, this is like unanimous, that women were the ones that went to the earliest tomb. Okay, time out. Our earlier question. If the women went to the tomb, what didn't they do? They didn't take shovels and go over in the dirt and dig up the rectangular grave. So if you think the women went to the tomb, we're already back on, we're past the burial. So the women go to the tomb. And all the sources say the women did this, all 4 Gospels. Now, contrary to popular opinion, Jews aren't the only one that put women down. As different authors have said, it was the major view around the entire Mediterranean. Women were second-class citizens, guys were the boss. So if you're back again, you're these 4 gospel writers, you're not writing in 4 bedrooms in the same house. Like historically, Mark's from Rome, John's from Ephesus. These are long distances away. Why do they all tell the women? Maybe it happened that way. And if the women are the first ones to the tomb and they find the tomb empty, that is by far the most critical argument. That they use it women, which is horrible because, again, criteria, it's embarrassment. I want all the critics, I want all you Romans to believe me. The tomb was empty because the women found it. They start walking away from you at that point. If you can put your best foot forward, here's what I would say. The men went to the tomb. And I'm not lying. Because in both Luke and John, men go to the empty tomb after they hear the women's reports. But I could start with the men if I wanted to be respectable. They don't care about respectable. They want to be factual. So the first one is that the women went to the tomb and saw Jesus in a group. Second reason is what Mike Licona and I, in our co-authored book, Case for the Resurrection, we call it the Jerusalem factor. If Jesus was buried in Constantinople, somewhere in Egypt, if Jesus died somewhere else, and the preaching starts in Jerusalem, like what early chapters in Acts say, and the creeds in Jerusalem, nobody would go to Egypt, Alexandria, to check this thing out. Nobody would go to Constantinople. But these guys have the guts to preach the message when the tomb is minutes away. If Peter goes, he's raised, not like David. David's body decayed, Acts 2. David's body decayed. Jesus did not decay. His body did not decay. What happened? Because he was gone. He appeared. Oh, yeah? Well, I just made a trip to your tomb, and that tomb is full, buddy. Okay, now, critics like to say this. What if a critic went to the tomb, and they found a body there, but the face was rubbed off, it's decomposed, and they don't know who it is? Then the disciples would be wrong, because they didn't just say Jesus walked out of the tomb. They said nobody was in the tomb.
Tomb was empty.
Nobody. If you find a body in the tomb, you've disproven it. So you could go there as much as you want. The stones, you can walk in. You can take you can take an afternoon walk. He's not there. Jerusalem is the last place they can preach if the tomb's not empty. The last place. So I think the fact that they chose Peter, go to Alexandria and preach. They can't check it out. But if you're going to preach with the body right there, that's silly unless the tomb is empty.
That was an interesting response, because oftentimes critics will push back and say, well, even if the body was there, it wouldn't be recognizable after, say, 50 days, a couple months roughly. But your point, if I'm understanding you correctly, is saying it's not like they found some body and couldn't recognize it. You're saying there was no body at all, recognizable or not. That's what the apostles found.
Yes, there's two problems. That's one. If there's any body, you lose. Here's the second one. Michael Licona and I have each talked to medical examiners who examine bodies that are taken out of rivers and people who are dead in the woods for a long time before they're found and everything. And we both asked medical examiners without even knowing what we were asking. They didn't know. We said, could you recognize a body after a week, 2 weeks, a month? And what if and how far can you go? They said, there's two answers. They said, yeah, you can still recognize the body. But here's the second point. Let's say the face is kind of wiped off a little bit. How about this? We found a body in the tomb, and there's nail holes in the wrists and nail holes in the feet. I think we got you guys. No body in the tomb, and you'd still be able to tell by the nail holes it was probably Jesus. They had nothing like that. And why did thousands of people come to the Lord, according to Acts, on the first two sermons? 5,000 people come to the Lord. If they can walk to the tomb and see Peter's a liar. Because, Peter's one of the men who were told went to the empty tomb after the women were there. And they walked away scratching their head. And we're told that John believed, but Peter still didn't know what to think. That's interesting. The disciples didn't believe because they found the tomb empty. They believed that they saw him appearing. That's always the key.
So women discovering the empty tomb, even Dale Allison, his recent book on the resurrection, says this is a good argument. And he's obviously takes a very skeptical approach to this. Preaching in Jerusalem. Others will cite things like multiple attestation of the empty tomb, the citing of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15.
I would make multiple attestation number 3.
Number 3 you would. Okay.
And now we got 3. And go ahead. You were talking about Paul now.
Well, I was mentioning a couple of the other kind of common arguments that are made, such as the body being stolen presumes that the tomb is empty. Are there any from kind of the lower, like 15, that don't get a lot of press that you think is a good argument for the empty tomb that apologists should make more commonly? Or do you think the common ones that are made typically are the stronger ones?
Okay, we said women, Jerusalem, and multiple attestation. This one could be the best one, and it's one of the top 6 or 8, depending on how you count them. Tom Wright's argument that is also present in Gundry, Robert Gundry's book Soma, also in Mike Licona's big dissertation, and also in, if you've ever read John Cook, he's got 2 500-page, one on crucifixion, hundreds of pages long, published by a German publisher. And John Cook, who's really critical, probably more critical as far as what he accepts than any of us, he starts out the beginning. He tells you on page 1, I want you to know my conclusion up close. He said, I'm going to argue that the preaching that Paul did about the resurrection body is significantly the same as what the Gospels preached about resurrection body.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
here's what Cook, Gundry, Licona, and especially Tom Wright, 550 pages. Here's what they all have in common. They use words anastasis and agero, the Greek words for raised. And those words, always and only. Now, Tom's a little strict. Sometimes, I mean, he says there's no exceptions. Now, people have found one or two. But in all of history, if you're in Greece and you believe there are ghosts, good for you. You believe somebody came back as a wispy spirit, good for you. But you don't use the words anastasis and agero. Those are Greek words. You could use them. You don't. Why not? Because anastasis and agero mean bodily. In fact, the word anastasis means to get up again. Years ago I was preaching in Stockholm, and the preacher was preaching in Swedish, and my interpreter was right next to me. And he got up for Easter Sunday. I was the speaker, but he gave a little introduction, and he said, Uppstandelse, Easter morning. And everybody goes real kind of like dead. Uppstandelse. No, Uppstandelse. He says it 3 times. Uppstandelse. I asked my translator, what does that mean? The Swedish word means to stand up again. And that is what anastasis means. It means to stand up. So Greeks and Egyptians don't use anastasis and agero. It always means bodily. So if all I know is that anastasis and agero mean bodily, when they use that word over and over and over again, it can only mean one thing, bodily.
That's a really interesting argument, because a common objection has been in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul means a spiritual body taken as immaterial. But if N.T. Wright and Licona are right, and I think they are, spiritual is orientation, not composition. And if that lines up with the Gospels, you have an early support and belief in the same kind of bodily transformation. That makes sense to include that in the empty tomb. All right.
By the way, that's an area where the field has really changed. We mentioned one from Boltmann to a wispy resurrection to a bodily resurrection. Here's another one. At present, the majority New Testament view, all the way from evangelical scholars with PhDs in New Testament or a relevant field, all the way to atheist New Testament scholars or Jewish non-Christian scholars with PhDs in a relevant field. And the majority view today by far is that if anybody saw anything, let's put it this way, let's not talk about what they saw or didn't see. What they meant when they said Jesus appeared is bodily. Bart Ehrman believes that Paul's view was of bodily appearances. That's an old argument that in 1 Corinthians 15, it's the wispy Jesus on the way to Acts. And by the way, when critics use that in debates with me, they'll go, oh, pardon moi. Paul says he saw, okay, first baloney. You're citing Acts 9, 22, and 26. You're doing what you tell me not to do. You're citing a secondary source. Dom Crossan says this. You're citing a secondary source. Let's cite Paul. Well, Paul says spiritual body. Yeah, I know. I think you missed the word soma, which is the second word, spiritual body. Paul teaches body, and Ehrman says bodily resurrection is Paul's view. And if Paul teaches body, what about the Gospels?
It's amazing.
I love it. That argument alone could be the best one. You could like that one more than the women, more than multiple attestation, more than Jerusalem, and I wouldn't argue. Because it's the word they use over and over again, and only the Jewish view is that. Greeks didn't use that for their heroes. They used wispy ghost and spirit. They used pneuma. Oh, here's a good one for you. Philippians 3:21. He will raise our vile soma, body, to be like unto his glorious What? Pneuma? Oh, this could be dangerous. No, he will raise our vile soma to be like unto his glorious soma. There's the narcissist. You don't make a move like that. How easily could Paul have said, he will change our vile soma to be like his glorious pneuma, his beautiful pneuma, like I saw on the way to Jerusalem. No, he goes body. Philippians 3, another one is Romans 8:11. He will transform our bodies to be like unto his soma. There's a bunch of verses like that, but Philippians 3:21 is a great one. Because Paul could easily have said glorious pneuma. He doesn't.
So we've walked through the 6 minimal facts, a couple of the additional facts, the burial and the empty tomb. Those
we also
other
talked about center of faith, which is one of them.
Good. So 3 of the other facts, folks can go to the book and read in some depth. I want to ask you 2 kind of big objections that I've seen come up in these conversations. And I was really grateful that you had an extensive response to this in your book. So obviously I don't have to walk through all of the points, but 2 towards the end of the evidence. Maybe just give us 1 or 2 reasons why you don't find this compelling. Is that sometimes critics will claim that there has been legendary development in the Gospels from Mark to John. So we allegedly see this, or we see it in development in terms of appearances of Jesus, the angels at the tomb. What are your thoughts on the legendary development objection?
All right, let me give you 2. You want 2? All right. You want us to think, if you're the critic, you want us to think there's a whole lot of difference. Let's take a look at the difference. Matthew and Mark, there's 1 angel at the tomb. Luke and John, what are there, 20? No, there's 2. And of the old saying, if there's 2, there's 1. So there could have been 2 with Mark. There could have been 10. And Mark chooses to talk about 1 of the 10. Matthew talks about 1. The difference is between 1 and 2. That's how much change there is. Women, okay? There's a Mary in all 4 accounts. But in John, it says Mary and others. We don't know.
Okay.
Luke doesn't even name the women till you get away from the tomb and they get back to the disciples and they tell you the names. So he's not trying to die for this. But Mary's in all 4 accounts. We have another Mary in 3 of the 4 accounts, and only 2 women are only in Mark and Luke. So Salome and Joanna, they're the only 2. Is that a whole lot of liberality for 40 years? You went from 1 angel to 2 angels, and golly, you got 2 more women? Woo! This is just mythology abound. No, it's nothing like that. But here's the better argument. I gave it earlier when the Muslim scholar said, I always flip to the discrepancies in the Gospels. I will give those responses, and then I'll say, let me give you a more direct response. I don't give a rip. That's not my view, but we're doing an argument here, not my view. I always say that. I teach at Liberty. You know what my view is. But if you want to say there's problems there, I think you're wrong, but I'm not going to debate that. I'm here tonight to talk about the appearances. And what critics say is, oh, yeah, there's some development there. What about the appearances? Oh, yeah, they happened. Well, then what's wrong with your differences objection? It amounts to nothing. In other words, there are a lot of critics who believe the Gospels are full of errors, and they affirm the resurrection appearances of Jesus. That really blows it away right there. That objection, and by the way, they usually get them in the burial and resurrection accounts. That's where they come from, most of the conflicts. But it's the most common objection that critics have raised since English deism prior to Friedrich Schleiermacher in 1799, the birth of Christian liberalism. The biggest objection up until the present, from about 1725 up to the present, is discrepancies.
Number 1.
Yeah. Now, what does discrepancy show? Well, you idiots believe in inerrancy. Okay. What if we don't assume that? We play your game. Oh, well, then you get a resurrection. Thank you. That's all I'm talking about. And if you're going to get the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus from just the data, here's how the worst the argument could go for me. You've shown a couple of discrepancies, women and angels. There's almost no difference there. Women and angels. And I've shown the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I'll take my view over your view. Thank you. Having results from mine. What do you get from yours? By the way, Sean, in a recent survey, I do argue from NDEs to the resurrection, as Dale Allison notes in uh, the recommendation. If NDEs prove that life after death, and you can't use the word proof, but use the word
Sure.
proof like probability. If there is an afterlife, why should critics argue about the resurrection? If you've already opened the door to afterlife, then listen to me when I talk about resurrection. All right. So I already have an in to resurrection, but here's another one. In a recent survey of atheists and agnostics only, 32% of them said they believe in an afterlife. 32%. Why? It doesn't follow from your view. Why do you? Well, maybe it's because I like it, which means you're not very logical. Number two, maybe you find good evidence. Good. I'll agree with you. Oh, maybe you read an article on NDEs. Cool. Maybe you read something on the resurrection. That's how I got to know Jordan Peterson. He found a little 3-page article I did on minimal facts argument. He tweeted it or retweeted it or something. And we got to be friends because he cited my argument. He goes, I got to think about this. And I don't think he means my argument. I think he means the topic. He said, this could be the most important subject I've ever entertained. But it was the minimal facts he brought out because that spoke to him. He thought there were errors in the Bible. He wasn't a believer in God. But he said, if you're going to use these facts that everybody else gives you, I better pay attention to this. So my bottom line is, let me table the objections for now. I'll handle that somewhere else. By the way, my research assistant, Ben Shaw, who's finished his PhD, he's got a book coming out with InterVarsity Academic, 13 arguments for reliability in the New Testament, just to show you that minimal facts people can do the other New Testament argument. Well, look at this. I've got 600 pages, at least in my manuscript, 600 pages on the 12 facts, 6 minimal, 6 others, 600 pages. But I have 200 pages on the resurrection chapters in the Gospels in Acts 1 through 11. So I do use the reliability argument. Here's another one. Mike Licona uses minimal facts. Mike's doing a second book on reliability right now.
Yeah, he is. That's right.
Ben likes the minimal facts. He's got a book coming out with, it's a myth that we think it's the only way to argue. I have 200 pages on reliability. Mike's got his second book on reliability. Ben's got his first one coming out. We're the main guys that do minimal facts.
Well, I noticed that you brought that in, and you've done it in the past. You had that chapter in the book, Why I Believe, that's probably a book 15, 20 years ago that Geisler compiled. I remember you've done this in the past. It was good to see that brought in and explained here. We don't have to go into that. That's another conversation.
There's no way I would deny reliability arguments.
Of course. No, and I also love that you have the near-death experiences section at the end. Maybe we'll have you back sometime to talk about that. I've covered that a number of times here. And in my course in the resurrection, I talk about that because you open up the door to the afterlife, to there being more than the material world. Doesn't get you to resurrection, but it's a part of a larger case. I love that you include that. Let me raise one more objection to you that you deal with in the end of your book. This is one of the more common ones that I hear, and it's that Jesus was mistaken on the imminent coming of his kingdom. So in Mark 13:32, for example, Jesus seems to strongly imply that the present generation would see his return. Now, you deal with this all the way in almost page 900 in your book towards the end, but tell us your thoughts on that. Why don't you find that a compelling objection?
First of all, years ago when I was going through my doubt, I stopped everything for 2 weeks, went to the library, pulled out 100 books, and studied that. And that one at 1332 is not a very good objection because in the same text, same context, Jesus says, by the way, I don't know when I'm returning. 1332 is the one. He says, that one knows no man, nor the angels, nor the Son. But wait a minute. You said it's this generation only. I can pull Gingrich down from my shelf, the Greek commentator, Arton Gingrich, the best-known Greek lexicon. You look it up in the shorter lexicon by Gingrich, and you look up Genea, the word for generation. You know the first definition, the only definition, race. This race will not pass. What was Jesus' point? Well, the Philistines are gone. Most of the other tribes are gone. The Assyrians are gone. The Assyrians, the Syrians, the Babylonians, they're all gone, but Jews are still here. That's a meaningful point. There's a bunch of other ones, too. I have an article where you already related some of the arguments. But I think Mark 13, I think, is a really bad argument because here Jesus says in the context, I guess you didn't hear me. I said, I don't know when I'm returning. But you said in this generation, the word can also mean race. It can mean people. It usually means generation, but it doesn't have to. Here's another argument. This is the better, I like these other arguments too, where I can say I really don't care. Now I'm not going to say that about this one because Jesus would be mistaken. But here's what I would say: Jesus' number one lecture point, according to almost everybody in the New Testament, it's not part of my minimal fact because it's not during the. Well, it does happen in resurrection, but his number one teaching is the kingdom of God and how to get there. In Mark, he came out preaching the kingdom of God. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. It's his number one teaching. And interestingly enough, after he rises from the dead in Acts 1, he's still talking about the kingdom. And when Paul goes on the way to Damascus, he's still talking about the kingdom. It's his number one teaching. All right, here's my argument. If his number one teaching was the kingdom, and he specifically says, I don't know when I'm returning, if perchance he guessed and was wrong, it's not his big point. His main point is the kingdom is coming. The resurrection says it's coming. And if he were a false prophet by any definition, why did God raise him from the dead? I think that's a good comeback is, if he was wrong about time of his coming, he's a pretty bad false prophet. Number one, he's off his subject. The subject is the kingdom, not the timing of the kingdom. Just like we know the second coming, but we know the timing of the second coming. Jesus said, I don't know the timing. But the second one is, if he were a heretic, why did God raise him and only him in the history of religion? We have no other evidence that a founder of a major world religion was raised from the dead, even by his Orthodox followers. None. So I've got to take a stand for the argument that God raised him because his teaching was true. And what was his teaching? If you want to get to the kingdom, believe in me, follow me, and what you do with me. This, even Boltman says this. If you want to boil down Jesus' argument, it's like this. What do you do with me? Because what you do with me determines where you spend eternity. That's what Jesus preached, and eternity is the kingdom. Yeah, but he's wrong about the coming. Well, if it's that bad, first of all, I don't think he was. I give all kinds of those arguments, and I've done it elsewhere. But the main thing is he couldn't have been a heretic because his father raised him. That would be pretty bad. I mean, the slight goes on the father then.
Gary, in many ways, we just kind of hit the surface, scratch the surface on your book. I have many more questions for you, but let me ask you kind of a few, just to somewhat wrap up, personal questions about this.
Sure.
You publish with Broadman and Holman Academic Press. I've done some books with B&H, love the folks there. Why publish with a Christian press as opposed to a secular press?
First of all, I didn't try any press. I didn't send out a synopsis. I didn't send a thing out to any press. But Baker called me, Zondervan talked to me, and the other publishers. And I don't spite them at all. I know they're not secular, but Zondervan has a secular arm, or the other way around. The secular arm has Zondervan.
Right.
But they said to me, and I'm not putting them down at all. They're my friends. Stan Gundry called me from Zondervan, good friend for a long time. They said, if you were to come to us, here's the problem. We're going to want you to raise $400,000 before we can even take this project, because that's how much it's going to cost us to get this thing off the ground before we earn our first dollar. And to cite Stan Gundry, to cite him, and I don't judge him one bit. He said virtually no publisher in this country has that deep of pockets. That was his comment. And please, for you people listening, Stan Gundry's a saint to me. He's a really good friend. I'm not putting him down. He's just giving facts. We're going to get that money because we don't have the money. All right, so B&H called me out of nowhere because the editor of B&H used to be an editor at Zondervan. He was there when we talked. Okay, he calls me, and he's got a PhD, by the way, in historical theology. That senior editor at B&H called me and said, hey, what's the status of your 4-volume thing right now? I said, I haven't found a publisher. I haven't really been looking. He goes, why not? I said, well, first of all, I just haven't looked. But secondly, these guys want me to raise $400,000. Lexham was a little lower, but they were still very high. He goes, you come with us and you don't have to raise a penny.
Wow. That seals it.
I won't say that was it, but that did make me look. I didn't feel like going out and raising $400,000.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
They've got ins with the whole denomination. They've got ins. Their books can go over to what's Lexham's
Logos and Faith Life.
Logos. Yeah, I've got books on Logos. You probably do.
Yep.
They can take this over on Logos. It can still go over there, but they said we're not going to charge you a penny.
That's
And now
amazing. Okay.
we found out today that someone sent it to me. I'm trying to remember what it's called. I don't want to misrepresent them. Amazon's list of hot new books in some area of religion, and they have a list of 76. I didn't see it, but yesterday I was told this book was number one.
Well, it should be.
They didn't send it to me when it was number one. The guy sent it to me today, and we'd fallen all the way to number two. So
Well,
it's called an Amazon hot new release. Here's the problem, the issue: the book doesn't come out till Monday. It's already the top new release, and it's not out.
well,
So
we're, we're
I hope. What I'm saying is, I hope Robin Holman, they're going to get their money back pretty quickly. It's already a real hot deal.
I hope so too, and I hope folks will pick it up for sure and read it. It's worth the. It's not a cheap book, but it is worth it and some for sure. How
Let me
come?
say
I
something
think.
about that. I was asked to
Yeah,
mention this to you guys
sure.
by the same gal who tried to send the book to you. She mentioned it in the email. That book, this big book, sells for $80 plus tax, $79.99, $80 plus taxes on Amazon. If you go to Lifeway, which is the parent company of B&H, for just a few more weeks, they're selling the book for $58 or $59, the
Oh,
big one.
great, great.
So you can get it a lot more cheaply there. And I want to make sure everybody understands. I was not dogged Baker or Zondervan one little bit, and Stan Gundry in particular, great friend. If it costs $400,000, it costs $400,000. They're right. I don't object. I just said when someone told me you don't have to raise it, that's why I went with
Oh,
B&H. In
I want to
fact, you
get
could
you
take. Go ahead.
out of
Go
here
ahead.
because of time, but let me ask you this final question.
Yeah.
And here's the final question for you. You started studying the resurrection like 5 decades ago. What does it mean to you personally to see this massive volume come out and hold it in your hands?
Sean, I am so thrilled for this reason. One of the guys who wrote a blurb for this book, um, I'll tell you who it was. It was Craig Hazen at your
Hmm.
school. Craig wrote and he said, I hope I don't misquote him, but he says something like, I should get the book and read it. But he said, this is going to be the go to book on the resurrection for a couple generations, and I'm only talking about volume one. Okay, that's what I'm thinking about it. Other guys said things like that. But if it's the go to book for a long time to come, I've done my job. Long
Hmm.
after I'm gone. Um, you know, I want it to be out there and be a witness. I want it to touch people's lives. And here's the most touching thing I could say. Um, I'm remarried, thankfully, got a wonderful, beautiful wife. But the mother of my four children died in 1995 of stomach cancer. And a famous thing that I've published, I sat on the front porch of my house. I imagined this. Well, I did sit on the front porch of my house with a child monitor next to me. Well, she was upstairs and she was sleeping from the drugs, and she eventually died. Um, and I make believe, I'm asking God. I actually did ask him this, but make believe, I'm saying to God, Debbie's only 43 years old. Why is she
Hmm.
dying? And her only wish is to see her grandkids, and she's not going to see a single one. What's going on here? And I picture God saying to me, here's what God would say in my mind. I picture God saying to me, Gary, I know you're hurting, but what kind of a world is this? And I said, Lord, I don't know. Deb's up there in bed dying. Why are you asking me what kind of world is it, Gary? Please. What kind of a world is this? Well, I don't know. Given my background, it's a world where Jesus Christ died on the cross, he was raised from the dead. That's the main thing I
Hmm.
can say. And God said, good start. So if you know Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead, what does that tell you about Debbie? Um, she's probably going to go to be with Jesus. Okay, pretty good. What's going to happen when you die? I hope I'm going to go there and be with Debbie. And he said to me, and then God says to me, my son, one day you will be with her and you will walk hand in hand and down the streets of heaven. I wasn't remarried at that time, but in fact, she wasn't even dead. But he said, you'll walk hand in hand with her down the streets of heaven. But Lord, yes, I know, Gary, there's some pain and suffering here. I can't explain that to you right now, but there is an answer. If there's a death and resurrection, trust me that there's an answer to a lesser problem, which is the problem of pain and
Hmm.
suffering. So the resurrection to me is the ultimate answer to the
Amen.
question, why this and when will it be rectified? And if it's eternal life and it's rectified there, it makes all the difference in the universe.
I love it. Amen. Well, I want everybody watching this, believe it or not, pick up volume chapter 1. Read it. It'll take you a week to read it. It took me a long time, and I'm familiar with these arguments. Gary, I can't wait for volume 2. Volume 3 is going to be helpful, but really in particular, volume 4, what this means and how to apply it is powerful. I have been praying for you and just your health to be able to finish and work through this project. Just what you've been through in your life is such a gift to the kingdom. At Biola, we appreciate your friendship. We appreciate all that you're doing, and we're going to continue to partner for a long time. In due time, when I fully update my course, I'm going to be working your book into it for sure and making it one of the texts that we use. It was gratifying to see you cite my work a couple times. I told my wife, I was like, wow, it's valuable. It was really awesome and just so encouraging that was a piece of it. But
the chapter on transformation, you're the man.
Well, I don't know about that, but that was encouraging. I know you got to run, but folks, before you leave, make sure you hit subscribe as well. We got other shows coming up. We cover the resurrection regularly. We'll have Gary back to continue to talk about this, maybe probe into near-death experiences. And if you thought about studying the resurrection, I would love to have you in class, do a full semester class called In Defense of the Resurrection, where we look at these issues in even more depth. Gary, you've got family time coming up, so got to let you know, but appreciate your work. Appreciate you, my friend. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Sean.